Join me today on Walk with History as we explore some of the unknown stories behind the mass graves at one of the oldest cemeteries here in Memphis, Tennessee, Elmwood. History, veteran and historian, here today in one of the oldest active cemeteries in Memphis, Elmwood. Elmwood was made popular from that 1993 Tom Cruise movie, The Firm, where he actually comes here to this cemetery for the funeral of one of the lawyers from his law firm. But today we're going to explore some of the stories of the mass graves here in Memphis. What's interesting about this cemetery is established in 1852. First burial happens here in 1853. There's 75,000 people buried here, and it's 80 acres. This cemetery is needed to be moved on the outskirts of Memphis as more people started to move into Memphis. And so at the time, this was more outside of the city. Now it's more prominent downtown. There's a great audio tour that you can take to talk about more of the prominent people buried here, and Walk with History will have a video about that as well. But know that it's open daily, 8 o'clock to 4:30, and it's located on South Dudley Street. Epidemic of 1878 was the most significant one for the city. Half of the 50,000 residents of Memphis fled the city because of the epidemic, and the remaining people left here, 90% would succumb to yellow fever. So much so that this cemetery was overwrought with victims, and they just piled them here. And at one point, they all just got buried here. And these victims came from every facet of life. You have priests, you have doctors, you have nuns, you have women of the night, all buried here together. So fast, so quickly, there was no way to recognize them or mark them, and so this marker was erected instead, no man's land. This epidemic was so significant to Memphis, it lost its charter. It was no longer a city when all those people left. Now, yellow fever epidemics are not unique to Memphis. You'll see them in Washington, D.C., Norfolk, any places along the water. But it hit Memphis so hard that here in Elmwood, one of the oldest cemeteries, there's a whole area dedicated to the 2,500 people buried here. This mass grave here at Elmwood represents the Tennessee Children's Home Society, where 19 unknown children are buried. This Tennessee Home Society was basically a baby black market ring that looked like adoption, but it was adoption to the highest bidder. Joan Crawford got 2 of her children this way, and Ric Flair, the wrestler, is a victim of this. Basically, children were stolen from poor parents and sold into adoption. Their birth records were destroyed, so it's hard to even know where and who these children belong to. 19 of those babies that didn't make it are buried here in a mass grave. People leave toys here to remember those children. What happened here actually changed the law and the way adoption is handled today, and it's one of those sad stories of American history. Vicksburg, and I showed you the marker for the Sultana, a steamer ship that was loaded up with men who had just been released from Confederate prisons during the Civil War. They loaded onto that steamer on April 23rd, 1865, after just being released from all these Confederate prisons at the end of the Civil War. It's a steamer ship that can hold about 300, loaded with about 3,000. gets up here to Memphis, and on April 27th, it explodes in the river, sending 1,500 men to their death. That death toll exceeds the Titanic. It's the biggest maritime disaster in American history. And the reason why no one knows about it is because John Wilkes Booth was also killed that same weekend, and that made the headlines of the newspapers. This marker here is erected in a mass grave of some of those victims of the Sultana here in Elmwood Cemetery. Under the tattered flag of the Confederate States of America from the Civil War is an area known as Confederate Rest here at Elmwood Cemetery, a mass grave of over 1,000 soldiers who fought for the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. For the longest time, they remained unknown, and then a notebook was found that had the names of 945 men and the number at which they were buried. So some of them have been identified, but some are still left unknown. Leaving the mass graves here at Elmwood Cemetery, these individuals who may not have known each other in life are eternalized forever in history. Something we can all learn and remember anytime we visit a graveyard. On to my next Walk with History.